Hello again and welcome to our second panel discussion. This time we focus on regulation and legislation, which is of course a key topic with AI, and who is ultimately responsible for AI decision making, which is a very interesting and difficult question to answer, in fact. But we have got three experts talking to you about this. And Anne is an expert in FinTech, in AI, works as a leading consultant for IBM, and also has got deep understanding on the whole cybersecurity world, and how to make sure companies are staying safe, and how, of course, AI works, because Anne has been a co-editor of mine for the AI book, which has been published by Wiley, as many of you know, and we've got, many AI fans and authors as well here among our guests today. So what I would love to do now is to hand over and to you, and looking forward to.
Thanks, Susanne. So, I'm Leslie. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. I got involved, as Susanne said, with FinTech Circle thanks to the AI book. I'm joined today by two of our authors. I'm delighted to be with them. So we have Shailendra Malik, who's VP at Singapore, and Şebnem Ulbrich, who's in Berlin. And we are going to have a panel which I hope is going to stimulate a lot of debate. We have some, not touchy points, but points of contention, sort of different perspectives. And we deliberately wanted that on this topic because, if nothing else, we want people to leave, maybe not with certainty, but with better questions. And with that in mind, I'd like to maybe just kick off with you, Shailendra, talking about this topic of regulation, which is often a topic left to the expert, policymakers, lawyers, and yet the impact of AI, the impact of lawmaking, of supervision and regulation does have a very real impact on us as private individuals, beyond our professional roles. Could you just give us a little bit of context about where you feel regulation is, how we got to where we are in the dialogue on it today, and maybe some perspectives of where you think it should be going?
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for having me in the panel. Very valid question that yes, regulation for any sector which serves the society in mass is required to ensure that the value which is promised to be delivered is delivered, and that regulation ensures that whatever goods or services have been given to the people is impartial as well as holds the value it promises to hold. From that angle, I believe the way regulation is being discussed about and the way it has been evolving, it is on the right track, but I still feel that we are slightly slow in our regulatory evolution, as far as the technology is being quite speed up in past few years. And a lot of that speed that technology has taken up is purely because of the AI and the big data revolution that has happened in the later half of the decade as well. So regulation itself is trying to solve a few more questions at their end before they start to solve questions for the public at large. So I believe there are some good steps already taken, but there is a long road to go ahead.
For sure. Maybe over then to you, Şebnem, because what's interesting on this panel is that we have sort of technology expertise and we have sort of policy making, legal expertise. And there can often be a bit of a dichotomy between the two, that these are two sort of forces that are in opposition. I think maybe one of the perspectives that we'll get is that they don't have to be. But I'd like to hear from you, Şebnem, on where the fault lines are with regards to kind of supervision and regulation, and what problems, for want of a better word, is AI showing with how we currently approach the topic of regulation.
Thank you, Anne. Another great question, and also thank you for having me here. We already had some exciting discussions before the panel, and I'm really happy to continue it during the panel. And coming back to your question, it is actually a bit of a slippery slope, because I understand that as a lawyer, when I mention that I'm a lawyer, people don't already like that. And when talking about regulations and policy making, it's already a scarecrow for technology experts and innovation activists. So we have to bear in mind that the regulations that we are designing and planning ahead should not limit the full potential of AI, but also shouldn't allow us to use some unsafe AI, or just let it run loose in the market. Yeah. So we have to basically make sure that we start early with our regulation, but then we also can see that the current regulation that we have, like for instance, the financial markets isn't optimal. Just take the Wirecard scandal. We just blindly trusted the regulator, the supervisory mechanism to make the right choices, to look into this company and to protect the market and the investors. But it just backfired. So maybe the regulations that we have currently are not so optimal. So we really have to see, how can we regulate it? Who should regulate this? And how can we be up to date? How can we create these dynamic regulations that are, continuously developing with the pace of the technology, instead of just, putting another paragraph in the law, that explains what AI is and the risks, around it, but actually does say nothing about all the potential risks that we might encounter in the next years and have no idea right now.
For sure. And I remember, Shailendra, during our prep calls, I think one of your first comments was, regulation is not a bad thing. The same way AI, I don't want to see it demonized. Neither should we be demonizing regulation. And I think a lot of what came out of our prep calls was this idea of balance, but perspectives shape your idea of balance, right? So how do we get a workable view of balance? What is it that we're looking for in terms of outcome? So you already touched on it in your initial comments about, benefiting people, societal good. Could you expand on that a little bit more about, how can we shape a view of where we're going, the vision, the principles, maybe? Is there a consensus view on that? So I'm in France. We've got Şebnem in Germany. Is there a very big disparity across the globe, depending on where you are, about the view of what is desirable?
Obviously, I feel that your culture, your upbringing, the country, the circumstances play a major role in defining of your value systems, and that value system ultimately drive what kind of regulation is required in that environment and in that space. So this is a common debate where people say that China, when it comes to data privacy, they just use their own citizens' data very openly, and citizens don't object for it, because people over there feel that this is a common belief over there, that it is okay. But you change the landscape and you come to US and you try to implement a similar model there, you will find revolts happening. So it's always contextual what we are trying to do and what a particular regulation needs to do in a particular setup. And this is what I was highlighting before as well, that when we talk about regulating AI, we have to be very clear what we are trying to regulate. It's like you're saying that you want to regulate technology. Regulating technology is not the solution. You have to regulate the use case and why that technology is being used. AI is enabling the use cases. AI is making sure whatever promise that you are trying to give to the people to solve a problem, that problem is solved efficiently with no bias and with higher accuracy with the use of AI. Now, that problem statement itself, if that violates the ethical conduct or the ethical fabric of the society, that needs to be regulated, not the AI as a tool. So the contextualization of what needs to be regulated and what not needs to be regulated is what I have a slight issue with, because many times in the industry, we get too fixated about talking about regulating AI. I'm not saying don't regulate it. Obviously, AI is now being used in each and every sector that we talk about, be it medical, be it financial services, even in defense. So using AI in defense could be very, very harmful, because threat perception via recognition can trigger a particular event where it says that yes, an attack is bound to happen, so you preemptively attack first. And that kind of decision making can go horribly wrong if that is a case of a false positive. So where you are trying to implement AI as a solution, that should drive what kind of regulation it attracts.
Absolutely, that's a really interesting point. And again, I'm just coming back to Şebnem because we touched on a topic a little earlier, which was, you gave the example of blockchain regulation, right? So another complex technology with potentially very significant impact in a variety of industries. And you highlighted actually some limitations around how regulation of blockchain is being implemented. And you had some interesting thoughts around the parallels with AI and what you are hopeful that we will manage to avoid. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, what blockchain and AI has in common, except the hashtags on Twitter, of course, is the disruptive technology, you know, and automation behind it, and the potential use cases that could lead into risks and danger. And how governments and institutions handled it was quite segregated, because some institutions just lied low, you know, decided not to do anything about it. Some governments just banned it. Some governments were opposing IPOs, and some on digital assets and so on. And years later, we see that, you know, this is regulated by some countries like Switzerland, and which are, you know, trying to be the forefront of these regulations. And now even in Europe, we don't have a standardization, you know. So we have now this AML5, which is supposed to bring a bit more standardization to the applications of DLT and blockchain, but it's not. And then now Germany is over-regulating the topic, or being criticized for over-regulating, whereas some countries are under-regulating. And then if you are a company based in European Union and then you would like to use cross-border services, you cannot even use passporting, you know, with these kind of services, and just let alone, you know, the international scope of it. So like, it is just so diverse, you know, what you can get, how countries and institutions like regulators approach this topic, that I just don't want this mess to, you know, become the new standard for all new technologies that, you know, we might be using in the future, you know. So we should just start, I think, start with bits, you know, not, again, you know, like Shailendra said, not, you know, regulating the technology, but, you know, just having like this basic scope, the standard rules about it, about the ethics, about responsibility, accountability, and so on. And then just have mechanisms to track companies, you know, to see where they are, to have like these reporting mechanisms in place, to see, you know, what data they use, what data sets they use, you know, how they use it, and also inform the customer side, the consumer side, so that they know what they're opting into, you know, how their data is being used, you know, have some privacy sphere. And then, you know, basically just by starting slow in years, we see the risks associated with it, we see the use cases, and then we are then able to have like a better overview and a better regulation, you know. But I think that we should start slow and early before, you know, there's this patchwork of regulations all around Europe, all around the globe, where then, you know, it's hard to really standardize afterwards.
For sure, and that's, yeah, I mean, absolutely. We were talking earlier in our conversation around the importance of not hindering innovation, right? So that regulation is there for a purpose, but that its purpose is not to stunt growth. Its purpose is not to get in the way of creativity and moving forward. However, what you're describing is in some ways worse, right? In the interest of trying to protect, the disparity of approaches is creating massive uncertainty, massive complexity, and particularly, I suppose, well, it's going to be difficult for established corporations, but startups particularly have a real difficulty trying to actually get their heads around, well, what can we do? So we have a couple of questions coming in around this sort of theme, which is, what do we know about best practice? What do we know about what doesn't work? And what do we know about what is working in terms of trying to navigate what is established as a complex topic, but we have to find best next steps, right? AI is happening. So in that context, and as a given, which is, you'll say, we have a belief that it can be positive. What is our best next step to try and embed it with regulation so that they're not in opposition, that it can be maybe not a marriage, but it can be a relationship where there is a mutually beneficial reinforcing impact between the technology on one side and the regulation on the other. Either of you, please jump in if you have ideas of things that you've seen, both maybe in please don't do this, or absolutely accentuate this. It could be in sandboxes, it could be, Şebnem, for example, I know you had some thoughts on sandboxes in particular.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, as a lawyer, one of the best regulatory practices I have in mind is sandboxes, the absolute best example, best case, because it's a dynamic structure. It's not about rules, but it's about, integrating the new world and the old world together, educating them together, growing together, and then basically being a part of a mechanism that constantly grows and improves. So, and I read that, there are a lot of experts that are for a global sandbox that is just for AI, that just accepts AI applications and AI startups and is an independent body. And I actually find this idea not too bad, depending on, of course, who's in charge, who's leading, and, who's setting the rules and stuff, and how are the rules set. I find this approach quite good, actually, because then you get to actually have your foot on the door of the application side, know the startups that are there, because currently, as far as I know, there are more than 4,000 startups that are out there globally, but these are all the ones that we know and we can count. What about all the stealth ones? What about the ones that we don't know about? What about the ones that are, doing risky business, so to say? So, so we have to know all these, and we have to be able to assess this on a case-by-case thing, instead of putting them all in a box. Like Shailendra said, they all have like these different backgrounds, different expectations, depending on the market. We should be able to assess this, on a case-by-case thing in a standard process. And I think Sandbox is a great way to achieve that.
To unmute myself. Shailendra, I know, so, your role at DBS, major Singapore bank. Singapore has, as a territory, taken a very proactive leadership role on the global stage with regards to fintech and technology in the wider sense. And I know the Monetary Authority of Singapore is widely looked at for the different projects that it's undertaken and is often held up as the benchmark. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what you're seeing from a Singaporean perspective, initiatives that are happening, interaction between supervisor, regulator, regulated entities? It's just a perspective I think that would be interesting for the audience to hear about.
Sure. So yes, MAS has taken the pioneer stage in setting up a sandbox in the fintech space itself, not just for AI, but for other solutions as well, be it robo-advisory, be it blockchain. So they opened up with a sandbox a few years back itself. It's not new for them. And I feel that it has given a very good example for those countries who may be a bit more apprehensive in taking that particular risk, to show them the way that this is how it can be done. And Singapore is a success story in that particular space. So I agree with Şebnem that yes, Sandbox is a safer way to step into the technology, a new era of technology. But I also feel that a global sandbox will be not as effective as a country-based regulatory sandbox, because ultimately what you want a last mile coverage. You want the startups. For the case-to-case basis, you want to cover their problems, and you want to make sure that the problem they are trying to solve is really a problem that, as a society, that particular country is looking to solve for. You're not working on a use case which is far more high level, and it does not add value. So from that perspective, the local regulator or that country's regulators' involvement is a must. From the collaboration perspective, yes, having a global body helps, because then you can, once the startup is getting some sort of traction, some sort of critical mass is created for that startup, then it becomes a scaling point for that startup into the global market. But I guess Sandbox at a global level is not the solution. You may add another body within WTO, which will ensure that this kind of global collaboration can happen, or maybe in UN add another chapter for this kind of collaboration. But sandboxing needs to happen on a country-to-country basis, because a developing country may have a different use case coming in than a developed country. The financial inclusion problem that we face in India, for example, that is, startups around that particular space are far more targeted for solving that problem for India rather than solving that same problem in Philippines. Because even though both the countries are developing, the nature of the problem may be slightly different. The variables that pose themselves in that particular challenge may be slightly different. So the startup may be effective in India if it starts from there, but it may have to tweak a lot and pivot a lot if the same model and they try to use it in Philippines as well. So I feel sandboxing is the way forward, but rather than creating an overarching global body for it, it should be driven by country basis. Plus, also it gives a benefit for those countries who are aggressive in technology adoption. So because there was no global body to define the so-called rules and regulations, Singapore was able to take that particular step and go ahead and far ahead than other countries. Once you create a global body, then it also introduces the overall geopolitical dynamics to it, that which are the major funding nations, which is the biggest economy coming in, what is the buy-in coming from the top 5 countries as far as the use cases are gone, or a population dimension comes in. So the moment you start talking about global, all that angle comes in. So let the innovation happen locally and then scale up, use it as a global body, but not as a sandbox, I believe.
So maybe Şebnem, just building on that comment, we're kind of making the assumption that the existing supervisory and regulatory structures are the way forward, that they are adequate for actually taking on this complex role that is not, as Shailendra said, regulating the technology per se, but regulating almost the conduct around the use of the technology and the outcomes. Do you have any thoughts actually on the adequacy of our current regulatory and supervisory structures, and how institutional policy making happens today compared with the pace of change that we're seeing in AI? But you also mentioned blockchain, and I think there are some similarities between how those two disruptive technologies are actually being rolled out.
Absolutely great. Great question, but before jumping onto that, I would actually like to shortly comment on the topic before. Just I mean, I absolutely agree with your comments on the market side of, the free market side of this global sandboxes. But I also believe that some countries will need to be controlled, in the future from an ethical point of view, especially in the areas like you mentioned, the use of AI in war and health, and in these areas, so what are they doing? Are they being ethical? Are they, how are they using the technology? And we just need to know also about the mass use cases of these technologies too. So yes, it's not an optimal solution, like from a market practice point of view, but yeah, I mean, I think it needs to be discussed thoroughly, so it's not a yes or no kind of answer. And coming back to your question, as a lawyer, I'm sad to say that I don't find the regulators very sufficiently informed about today's technologies. Also, not very up to date. Also, the methodologies they use. These letters that they send to startups. About getting more information about the technology they use or the use cases, and then they get the letter back. They answer in 3 months, but in 3 months, the startup's use cases change and they are doing totally something else now. And this is how most of the regulators are working now, and maybe not in Singapore, which is a great example, and maybe we can learn more about it. And I would love to learn more about what's happening there, but especially not in some traditional, countries. This is just not not the case right now. And the current way of lawmaking isn't great. The regulators isn't great because they are not consisting of, a diverse like cross-practice body, so they have like these maybe business backgrounded people and maybe a couple of engineers if we're lucky, but that's all. But in order to create great policy that can be applied all through the market and can be standardized, you need like experts from all through the field. You need data scientists, you need engineers, you need like lawyers, of course, and business people, and then you need to bring them all in one room, and then they should be able to, make a decision, and not top down, not coming from the regulator top down, but, a consensus. And this is hard to achieve. And I think if we have this kind of structure, or if there are any regulators like that, then, these regulators are already, leaving their mark in the market, and we can already see that. I think we can already pinpoint at these regulators and say, okay, like the FCA might have a structure like that. So, in the future we need more of these, but at the moment I think we are not quite there yet.
So do you think that there will be kind of role modeling, right? So we've mentioned MAS in Singapore, we've talked about the FCA, and I mean, there's definitely, I think we can use the term role models, right, for their peers in the wider policy making and supervisory and regulatory sphere. Do you anticipate that there is going to be kind of cross-pollination of best practice through experimentation, for example? And even if there is, because I'm guessing that the answer to that question may be yes, is it going to be fast enough? Is the pace of adoption, the pace of change within these institutions, which, let's be said, we're not maligning them. They are there for a good reason and they serve a purpose, and their challenge is immense. But is their ability to actually sort of almost reinvent themselves in the face of this challenge, are those, kind of the policy making mechanisms, the institutional frameworks, are they malleable enough to actually stay relevant in the face of massive change? Because I'll just give a little bit of extra context. So, Shailendra, you were talking about sort of regulating on a country by country basis, but technology is almost like a nuclear cloud, right? It doesn't stop at the border. So what's going to happen when technology progresses in certain countries? If we are regulating on a country by country basis, sandboxing on a country by country basis, are we going to be able to stop the advance of technology coming from other places? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So, okay, so this is already a hot topic, and I think one way different governments are trying to stem the flow of technology is by controlling the data. Even though everything is on cloud, we have seen in past couple of years, many countries have now started defining their data policies, and data freely moving out of the country's borders is now becoming restrictive. So that is something that we have seen happening in the industry in past couple of years, and many countries have now come up with that kind of requirement. The intention or the thought process behind that is, if you limit the flow of the data going out, and you will have to create a local data center in the country to maintain that particular business model, or for that company to operate the same model in that particular country, you would be able to influence the technology to behave in the construct of that particular country's regulation. That is the whole intention behind it, and that is the thought process behind it. I agree to that to an extent, that yes, the customer sensitive data, you can limit that to a particular country, but then the evolution of the technology cannot be limited. If an innovation comes along, for example, Microsoft is there, it operates in almost all countries. If they feel Microsoft India has come up, or Microsoft Singapore has come up with a new model which is good, they will definitely be able to share that model across in different countries. Data may not be able to transfer over there, and then they can fine tune the model. So yes, the technology handshake can happen across the country, and you won't be able to control that because that is an IP of Microsoft or IP of that company. But I feel that we go very subjective in this kind of implementation, how we are implementing the regulation as far as the AI goes. Another thing which I wanted to cover here, and then I was just thinking about it when Şebnem was giving her perspective, is that we feel that the whole world has transformed into AI. We need to realize, even though we are talking about AI, we may be still the 1% of the tech space who are actually in that AI adoption space. Majority of the companies are still figuring out their way in AI adoption and AI maturity. So yes, regulation is required to provide them the guardrails so that they don't go haywire. But the AI, what you highlighted as a problem, both and Şebnem, that regulators have to rethink how to regulate or how to come up with the policies for blockchain and AI. We need to acknowledge that this is new for them as well. And it is not just new for regulators, for many companies which are incumbents, this whole phenomena is new for them as well. A bank which has been operating for 100 years, 50 years, they themselves have to reinvent their own self in past 2 years to adopt to and jump onto this AI bandwagon. So the way banks are hiring data scientists and they are building their own captive skill set into this particular space, regulators will have to do the same. Why are we comparing regulators differently from any other company? If a company needs to undergo that maturity cycle of AI, so does the regulators. And why you need to have a separate body if the same regulator can hire their own data scientists, their own skills, and add that particular dimension to their own company or their own space. They have the distribution channel, they have the reach to all the companies already. They are far more better placed to take the regulation to the last mile. Any new body you create, you will have to create a full distribution channel for that body as well. So we are kind of sidelining the whole process by saying that the regulators today are falling apart because they are not capable enough. I think it is only a matter of time that if they become aware that yes, this is what they are lacking, and these skills are required, and if they hire those skills and get themselves ready in that space, they would be able to come up with the policy and the regulation on that space as well.
Absolutely. Now, I mean, one of the things that actually has come up in discussions that I have had with policymakers and supervisors is their ability to attract the best talent. Because the types of people actually that go into those roles, they're rarely attracted by purely monetary reward. They're actually looking to serve a higher purpose. They're looking to, sort of mission motivated individuals. However, what they do often want is an environment around them that will allow them to keep on honing their skills, refining their skills, and have access to the best technology. And I have had sort of, one-on-one discussions with people in different supervisory organizations saying, we would love to be able to offer that environment to these people because we know we need them. And I think actually what I have learned through interactions with supervisors and policymakers is that while the organization as a whole might seem a little bit intimidating, it might seem a little bit, we can criticize it as being slow to react, but within those organizations, there are very talented, very motivated, very engaged individuals who really care. And I think maybe the challenge for the organization that they represent is allowing those people to exercise that intrinsic motivation that they have to do fundamentally what they believe is the right thing. And I think that's the challenge on the supervisory side, is finding the suppleness, the flexibility within the policy making framework and how you implement it and roll out to allow what are great people. The public sector is often criticized, but the public sector has amazing talent in it. And I think this is actually one of the areas where I would love to see the talent that's in the public sector shine, because it needs to. It's there and it needs to actually have a different viewpoint given to it. But I think maybe, Şebnem, a question for you is, where do you think we are in terms of timing? If we're too late, well, we're too late, but we still have to do something. But what if you kind of take a step back, where do you think we are on the continuum of time? Is now the right time? to start regulating or to go further? What do you think?
I would say yes, absolutely, which some people wouldn't like, I guess, but this is because of my approach of, regulate, like starting fast and in small pieces, because instead of having, waiting for years, until it breaks and then, seeing a massive destruction in the market and then regulating, because this makes the regulators scared too, because, the post-crisis regulation, I mean, we can see the market examples, like many market examples, like financial crisis and so on. And if it happens to AI too, God forbid, what will the startups face in the next years? I mean, if we start now, I think we have the advantage of still, being a pioneer, still, like shaping the regulation with the learnings we have, because I mean, if we look at some relevant questions for policy making, like we should ask ourselves: are the current existing tools sufficient? Not really. Like can we supervise? Can we have an oversight of all the companies that are using AI, that are creating use cases? Not really. And also, are there like severe risks associated with the use of AI, and the use cases? And yes, so judging from that, I would say there is a need for regulation, but not a massive amount of regulation, not a technology-based regulation, but it's more about defining like the ethical base for it, like what not to do, like absolute minimum. And then from there, like again, like a case by case evaluation, but starting now, and then being on top of things instead of just piling it up and panicking later. So I would say this would be the right approach.
We have an interesting question coming in, saying that our panel discussion is echoing some of the dialogue and debate around regulating the internet, right? That question that gets people very, very agitated. If we kind of place it in that context, and bearing in mind that we are, this is a FinTech Circle conference, so we're specifically in the context of financial services. Knowing what we know about financial services and boom, bust, financial crisis, and what can happen to the real economy when things go wrong. If we've got the difficulty of regulating something like the internet, right? And if we say AI is similar, different but similar. But on the other end of the spectrum, what happens when supervision and regulation goes wrong? What are your thoughts on that, right? Now, I know we're talking about two very far apart extremes, but doing nothing as opposed to over-regulating something and getting it terribly wrong, even though our intention might be right. What are your thoughts about that? Bearing in mind, again, financial services and impact to real people.
Shebnem, you want to go first?
Both of you, please go ahead. Yeah, I know it's a big topic. So
okay, so I would, to that particular sense, I guess, and then there is a follow-up question on that pace, on that as well. That will regulation ever keep pace with the changing landscape of technology itself? I believe I'll go with Şebnem's view on that. That sandboxing is the right way, because we have seen that working in Singapore. What regulator did was, when they created the sandbox and when the companies or the startups, when they started applying that this is their use case and this is their product that they want to build, the cross-pollination happened within the regulator itself. Because when they sat with the startups and go through their use cases, go through their pitch decks and the overall solutioning and what kind of data they are looking for, what kind of data will be used for the insights, whether the data is aggregated or not, or those kind of things. Many of these things were new for the regulator as well. So after seeing so many such applications and going through with them, regulators started to build their own understanding of how fintech as a whole is looking like, what kind of landscape these startups are going to paint, and for that landscape, what kind of regulation may be required. So, so it is a common education for both regulator as well as a safe space for the startup. And then that gives that sandbox idea gives the best way to to blend the both sides together. And as Anne mentioned, that there is amazing talent within the regulators and the public sector as well. And during that sandbox interaction, that talent may get energized and inspired to step forward and bring the right regulation in place as well, because that will be the right point to trigger a debate. What happened in the case of internet, and I guess I've seen that debate evolving in front of me, is that people were posturing and people were being defensive, and that sandboxing never happened in the case of internet. Internet always came in as a space for digitization rather than the space for innovation and what more can be done. And because nobody at that particular point of time, at least I'm not aware of it, went for a sandboxing of internet, that how internet can benefit the masses. There was always a friction between the regulators as well as the internet offering companies, that this what needs to be regulated, what is free of regulation. So I believe the sandboxing, if could have been done at that particular level itself, that might have created some common baselines between the regulators as well as the regulated entities as well. Şebnem, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I also agree that this internet topic is also parallel with AI and FinTech, because if you, for instance, look at Europe, we see that the internet laws haven't changed for the past 20 years. 20 years is a lot of time. Like, it's like actually centuries in internet time, you know. And now, as far as I know, like the European Parliament is working on this Digital Services Act, which is supposed to regulate the big techs, you know, regulate the algorithms they're using for targeting and for marketing and for e-commerce and so on, which is beneficial, of course. And but this is a topic that has been discussed for the past 5 to 10 years. Why wait 20 years overall to update this law? And now, you know, we might ask ourselves, after this law is in force, is this too late? You know, because we waited so long that now, you know, is it appropriate? Is it too little? Is it too much? You know, we'll see next year, because we still don't know the scope of the law, the regulation. But I mean, we waited 20 years, so it better be good, you know. Otherwise, I mean, why did we wait 20 years? You know, why didn't we regulate it before? Like, start early and small, you know, and instead of waiting until all the topics have piled up, until all the, you know, all the risks are, you know, already, you know, facing us. And you know, I don't know, like, there isn't much to do, you know, our hands are tied right now.
So taking, you know, that context around the complexity of regulation, that how these institutions function, well, it is what it is for now, right? And it will require a certain amount of time for them to adapt if and when they want to. In the interim, in this sort of intervening period starting now, do you, or maybe are you already seeing a kind of a self-organization in the industry where different companies are adopting different postures and maybe even actually using their approach to AI, their ethics, for want of a better word, around AI as a differentiating factor? So, you know, the regulation and the policy making is certainly one aspect. But while that is being formulated, are you seeing any companies sort of adopting a leadership stance or trying to differentiate themselves, or some even just throwing caution to the wind and saying, you know what, we'll take care of regulation later. For now, we have a free boulevard and we're going to make the most of it. What are you seeing in terms of the industry and how it is or maybe isn't self-organizing?
Okay, so I believe industry is self-organizing, and it is the major factor or major driver for that to happen is the consumer behavior. Is because the public opinion about what data they are sharing and what kind of touch points they are okay with, that has changed in past few years. And especially the new generation coming in, the millennials, the late millennials, or Gen Z generation, or whatever you want to call them, they are becoming far more socially aware and conscious. And they want their service providers, their companies, their banks, their fintech solutions as well, to set the example for them in that same space. So we are seeing that people are now preferring the vendors or preferring the products which they feel are abiding to that social construct or to that social kind of responsibility. And in a lot of times, companies have to see that if they have to maintain that particular trust with the end customer, they will have to be far more sensitive and careful of the usage of data that they are doing. And in many cases, if even a single case comes out that the AI or the whatever technology solution the company has put in is undermining that image the company wants to carry and connect with their customers, it is seen as a major kind of a trust loss. And nobody wants to lose the trust at this point of time. So I guess the consumer, in many cases, that self-organization is driven by the consumers itself rather than the companies being far more moral and driving that moral torch by themselves. And then that is a good thing that has happened. It has taken some time to happen, to be honest. But this change is far more sustainable because this will drive the consumer behavior for the next generation as well. And this will become a sustainable change.
Sure. We're beginning to run out of time, but I'd love just to get your closing thoughts, Şebnem, just on that, in terms of what you're seeing in the industry and its impact on the policy making that we're likely to see.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree that, like Shailendra said, the new generation is far more conscious. They're far more focused on these topics. However, there is the other side of the coin, which is like the entrepreneur's dilemma. So they're so excited about this new technology, about creating something that, like in most cases, they just proceed too far without looking back. Until they realize that something they created is disruptive, And actually, a research from last year has shown that, 40% of the companies that work with AI, only 40% of them have this ethical consciousness, inside. So only 40% have these ethical checks and these bias checks and, fairness checks, but the rest doesn't. So, I mean, I don't know if this number has improved in the past year, but I think it's a dramatical number, dramatical percentage right now, which should improve. And in that sense, I mean, I see a lot of these independent organizations and NGOs, working on this topic. And I think these are great initiatives. One of them, I think, is in Paris. Unfortunately, I cannot remember the name. But maybe it's not enough. And maybe, we should always have these, these supervision mechanisms or, light supervision at least to keep an oversight on these companies that, forget the ethical, the transparency, the accountability part, when they are, too deep into the technical developments.
So we're all out of time. We could have talked about this for hours, but sincere thank you to both of you for giving your time. It's been a delight. I think we have, at least I hope we have shown that the real value actually of creating these forums. So an applause to Susanne and the team at FinTech Circle for working tirelessly to kind of orchestrate these types of dialogue. And thank you once again for being with us in the audience, your engagement and your participation.
That's fantastic, Anne. Thank you so much for moderating this panel, such an exciting topic. And thank you for Shailendra and for Şebnem, to share your expertise, your knowledge. It was very exciting and very insightful. So really learned a lot as well. And now we have got a 10-minute networking break, and I would like to invite you all to do a couple of things. One is you can go to the lounge, which is a button on the left side, where you can meet the other attendees. So we've got almost 100 people here on this platform. So you can go to the matchmaking session, where you get connected to the other attendees. You can speak for a few minutes, and then you get matched to somebody else. So it's very fun, a fun thing to do. The other thing, please join the arena. In the arena, you've got several booths. So you can join, for example, the ITN production team, talk to the ITN team if you want to be featured in one of our next films. You can also watch the 10-minute showcase for the future of FinTech. So that's all available now. You can also join the Moody's booth, or the AI journal. So you've got this all available now in the next 10 minutes. We will start our third panel discussion 5 minutes late, so at 35 minutes. past the hour. So in about 10 minutes, we start, our next panel discussion. So I thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you at the matchmaking, and then I'll see you at the main stage in about 10 minutes. And thank you very much, Anne, again, for doing a great job as moderator.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.